All right, it is October 8th. It is a Thursday, and we're looking at Second Corinthians chapter 10. And we're going to read today, we're going to read all the way through and just kind of talk about some things that Paul was kind of addressing to the Corinthian church in regards to like what is ministry? What's the point of the kingdom work? What is it really compared to what it shouldn't be? Because not just during Paul's time, but especially nowadays, there is this confusion and misdirection of what ministry should be. And it's it's not to call anyone out, it's not to say someone's doing it right or wrong, but the reminder is for everyone, including myself, including you, including everyone that is going to be involved in ministry, which is every Christian. We can so easily make it about something that it is not, meaning we can lose our way, we can lose our direction and our identity in light of us looking more like the world than the kingdom. And so our priorities get shifted. And so that's what Paul is going to address today in today's passage is what is the priority of ministry? What is the point of it? And we'll go from there. Let me pray. God, we just thank you for this time. And as always, we gather to hear and discern your will. I pray for everyone that is at home navigating the tail end of the season to really give them wisdom and the ability to hear your voice. That this is more than just knowledge, that this is an avenue in which we connect with the supernatural being, which is you. And so, Lord, may the devotionals be rich, may the devotionals be life-giving, and may the devotionals help us to appreciate and love you more. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. All right. So I'm just gonna read all the way through. It's a 17 verses. 18. It's 18 verses, and we're gonna go through it one by one. All right. So let me just read it all the way through. By the humility and gentleness of Christ, I appeal to you, I, Paul, who am timid when face to face with you, but bold towards you when away. I beg you that when I come, I may not have to be as bold as I expect to be towards some people who think that we live by the standards of this world. For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. And we will be ready to punish every act of disobedience once your obedience is complete. You are judging by appearances. If anyone is confident that they belong to Christ, they should consider again that we belong to Christ just as much as they do. So even if I boast somewhat freely about the authority the Lord gave us for building you up rather than tearing you down, I will not be ashamed of it. I do not want to seem to be trying to frighten you with my letters, for some say his letters are weighty and forceful, but in person he is unimpressive, and his speaking amounts to nothing. Such people should realize that what we are in our letters when we are absent, we will be in our actions when we are present. We do not dare to classify or compare ourselves with some who commend themselves when they measure themselves by themselves and compare themselves with themselves. They are not wise. We, however, will not boast beyond proper limits, but will confine our boasting to the sphere of service God Himself has assigned to us, a sphere that also includes you. We are not going too far in our boasting, as would be the case if we had not come to you. For we did not get as far as you with the gospel of Christ, neither do we go beyond our limits by boasting of the work done by others. Our hope is that as your faith continues to grow, our sphere of activity among you will greatly expand, so that we can preach the gospel in the regions beyond you. For we do not want to boast about work already done in someone else's territory, but let the one who boasts boast in the Lord. For it is not the one who commends himself who is approved, but the one whom the Lord commends. All right. Something that stood out to me is verse 4 to 5. Paul talks about this idea that we do not live in the world, but the way we wage war is not of the way the world does it, and that the weapons that we wage with are divinely powerful to demolish strongholds. Now, what does that mean? Ministry is weird. Sorry, I keep looking out that way because there's a dog park right there, and I look at the dogs. Um, Ministry is weird in the sense that, let's say, for instance, like a computer company. There's a clear goal for a computer company. Build a computer, build it better, build it faster, and build it in such a way where it doesn't cost much, but you can charge as much as you want. And so there's always like this clear goal in terms of like that company, right? But when it comes to ministry, sometimes what is very interesting that I've experienced is that sometimes the goal gets confusing. Like you don't know what it is sometimes. Like you get confused, like you get lost along the way because the goal can be very vague because it's not something you can readily experience or touch or feel. Like for instance, when you build a computer, it's literally there for you to touch, see, and experience and reap the benefits. But when it comes to the kingdom ministry, sometimes like you don't experience anything right away, if at all. The benefits don't seem readily available, and heaven is not something you can literally see with your physical eyes, nor you can touch, but it's something you can experience at the same time. So it's like this weird kind of like world that we're trying to navigate through. And what we fail to understand is that the goal of ministry is very clear, in the sense that it's broadly described as the goal of ministry is pretty much the great commission. Now this is the crazy part. People can argue against that, like saying, no, people say, oh, that's not the goal of the church, or that's not the goal of ministry, that's not the goal of my ministry. And we got to correct ourselves in that sense, in that there's no such thing as my ministry. It's all God's ministry. We're just called to steward each section of it. And so think of it this way: God's ministry is big, and he gives portions of his ministry unto people to take care of. But the reality is, it's not ours to own, but it's ours to take care of. So let's let that be known. But people are arguing and even debating that's not what ministry is, that's not what church is, and whatnot. And the church in of itself is divided, right? Whereas a company, it has one singular goal. If you don't match up with that goal, you get fired. But in the kingdom, you don't really get fired from the kingdom. Once you're in, you're in. And even if you disagree, it doesn't mean that you're going to ever be subject to being kicked out. And so that's why for any of those that think you could lose your salvation, I am a firm believer you cannot lose your salvation. Now, will you experience the fullness of your salvation by the choices you make? Yes, that is determined by the choices you make. Just like with intimacy, your level of intimacy is dependent upon your level of investment, and what you're willing to sacrifice, bend, compromise, whatever, whatnot. But when it comes to ministry, what is it? Like, what's the goal? Like, what are we doing here? And Paul talks about this idea that the weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On contrary, they are divine power to demolish strongholds. Now, the word strongholds, when you think about the word stronghold, it's a building, like a fortified building in which another army or nation builds a stronghold so that they can keep a foothold in another place, more oftentimes at the borders of their nation or in enemy territory. You build a stronghold so that you have like a base to kind of fall back to in case the enemy attacks. The world is full of demonic strongholds. There's all these demonic strongholds that try to take root in people's lives or in nations or in people's groups or ethnicities, where the enemy is operating with power and authority over whatever the stronghold is built in. So for instance, a human being like you and me can have a stronghold. For instance, let's give an example. If you struggle with drug addiction, that's a demonic stronghold in your life. Not saying that there's no physical component to it, not saying that there's no like mental, emotional component, but spiritually speaking, there is a demonic stronghold in your life. It could be oppression, wounds, wrong thinking, brokenness. All these things can become strongholds, and they build up over time. For instance, if you and I keep indulging in the same sin over and over and over, it becomes a place where it's not just a foothold, it becomes a stronghold. It's fortified. It's It's like rooted in you. And that's why, like, when a person has stronghold, it's sometimes a huge battle to get rid of it, not because God is weak, but because we are unwilling to let go. The battles we fight against are demonic oppression, addictions. When God comes into the picture, it's never because God is incapable of setting us free like that, but because God honors free will in us. The battle is long because sometimes it's our inability to make the choice of letting go, right? When I look at the ministry Paul's ministry and the ministry of these false super apostles, they are colliding and coming to a place where one is God, Paul's ministry is exposing the false ministry of the apostles. And then the question again comes back to, what is ministry? What is ministry? And for me, and some people might disagree with this, but the ministry is pretty much the Great Commission. Go, therefore, make disciples of all nations. And if I were to think about it, I'm not saying my way is the only way. This is how I see it. Again, that's how crazy and hard ministry is, because everyone has an opinion. And they're not necessarily wrong per se, but there are definitely wrong answers, but there's definitely a lot of somewhat correct answers. The way I see ministry is this: make disciples, which includes missions, evangelism, and whatnot, training and teaching. Make disciples, have godly fellowship, and worship. When you put discipleship, worship, fellowship, when you put all those three things together, that is building the kingdom of God, in my opinion. And so many times as a church, what we do is that as we move forward into ministry, we lose sight of what the purpose is. Like, we become programmatic, meaning it's all about programs. It's about churning. It's about church attendance numbers and not really about discipleship. See, when you see these three areas of ministry, fellowship, worship, and discipleship, you need to do all three together well. If you focus on one too much over the others, what happens is that you get a distorted ministry. In the sense that if you focus just on worship, and when I say worship, I know worship is like lifestyle and whatnot, but I'm talking about worship in the sense of praise and like the worship experience on a Sunday or whatever time you gather. You may have a great worship experience, but if you lack in discipleship and fellowship, it becomes a concert. Let's say you focus on fellowship. If you focus purely on fellowship and disregard worship and discipleship, what happens is it becomes now just a social gathering. And there's no faith. It's just like any other gathering. Might as well just call it not church, but hangouts. The third, and this may sound crazy, but one of the pitfalls of just focusing on discipleship. Now, I know I'm not anti-discipleship, but when the focus is on this just purely on discipleship and you neglect fellowship and worship, what a potential problem that can happen from that is that the church becomes very programmatic. It becomes like a classroom. Because that's how like, especially in the Western world, we see discipleship as teaching. When discipleship in the Bible is more about life to life, walking with and doing while there's teaching. But I'm talking about the Western context. For me, I'm in the United States. Discipleship is oftentimes seen as teaching when it's more than that. But let's just say that's what it is, right? If we just focus on just teaching, what happens is that we become a classroom. You get your certificate, but there's no life. It's just knowledge, and there's no application. And so therefore, there's no rich encounter of God through worship. There's no rich fellowship, meaning there's no carry out in terms of living out the knowledge you have amongst other people. And so when ministry doesn't check itself from time to time, what happens is that the ministry kind of just looks like church, but isn't really fully operating as a church. Now, Paul, he's talking about the ministry that God has given him. And up until now, the issue was that especially if you look at verses 7 through 11, these super apostles or self-proclaimed leaders, they're constantly talking about how Paul is weak and Paul is nothing. He's not really the apostle. They're trying to discredit him. But the reality is Paul doesn't defend himself, but he just simply carries out the ministry of Jesus Christ, the ministry of the gospel that deals with discipleship, fellowship, and worship, all involved in the relationship with God. So Paul is pretty much saying, hey, you know what? Like, you could talk about how great you are and how crappy I am, but at the end of the day, I'm not even going to defend myself. I'm just going to carry out the ministry of the gospel. And in verse 12, you can tell sometimes when someone is not truly a steward of the ministry of Jesus Christ is when verse 12, this is one of the clearest signs of false spiritual leaders, is verse 12. We do not dare to classify or compare ourselves with some who commend themselves when they measure themselves by themselves and compare themselves with themselves. They are not wise. What's the one word that keeps sticking out to you in verse 12? Themselves. So what is he saying? These so-called great super apostles and teachers, their mode of comparison is themselves. They are the standard. They are not held accountable to anyone because they are the ultimate version of what a Christian should be. And Paul says that's not wise. If anything, if there's a spiritual leader that's like that, run away. Because a spiritual leader that is about themselves cannot be about God. And what happens is that when you are under a leadership where the leader is all about themselves, what happens is spiritual abuse and manipulation. And it's no longer about the gospel of bringing people closer to Christ through discipleship, fellowship, and worship, but it's now about fulfilling the agenda of those leaders. And so these super apostles, now Paul doesn't defend himself, but he defends his church. And so therefore, he doesn't do this false humility. I was like, oh, I'm just going to be passive. I'm just going to let the people do what they want to do and whatnot. Paul, though he is passive in defending himself, he is very passionate about defending his people. And that is a mark of a spiritual leader, where he's not worried about his reputation, but you best believe he is going to guard jealously. And I use that in a positive context. He guards with love his sheep. And so Paul is defending his ministry, not himself. And this ministry, he acknowledges, comes from the Lord, realizing it's not his, it's God's. And he says in verse 17, and this is the last thing we'll talk about, is it's not about if you self-congratulate yourself as these super apostles are doing, but it's all about if God approves of you. And so you realize the ministry of Paul is all centered not about him and what he can do, but it's all about God. And that's what ministry is. It's a ministry centered solely on God. If people, like for instance, if people forget who I am, but they remember who God is, done. Great. And that the ministry of Jesus Christ, the gospel, is about discipleship, fellowship, and worship, all for the glory of God, to the praise of God, and to love God and love others. If we're missing if we don't pursue that, then ministry becomes a business. Ministry becomes corporate. Ministry becomes a program. It becomes a school, but it doesn't become the church. It doesn't become a gathering of spiritual family members for the glory of God. And so, how can you apply this today? I think one thing that you have to ask yourself is if you consider yourself not a leader, just know that there will be a day when you are going to have to be a leader, whether you like it or not, whether you have a title or not. Because we're all called to live out the church. Church is not something you attend. Church is something you are. And a question you can ask yourself is, as simple as this question and as broad as this application can be, is, am I living for God? If I'm not in a position to disciple, am I being discipled? Am I worshiping and praising God on the daily, not just on the weekends? Am I in fellowship with my fellow believers? Nowadays, we are so connected but disconnected. There's no excuse as to why we can't meet up with anybody and just talk about our faith. And not saying that every conversation has to be about faith, but just getting to know one another. So those are some questions you can ask yourself. One, if you're not in a position to disciple, because maybe you're like really young or not ready. Who is ever ready, right? Are you being discipled? Are you praising, worshiping, and are you fellowshipping? And are you sharing your faith, not just with your words, but the way you live your life? Some questions to ask yourself, all right? Be blessed.